Hello, friends. I'm Forgettin' Scrolls, and today we're diving into something extraordinary, the Lost Library of Alexandria. Secrets that could have changed the world. Let's uncover what mysteries the ancients took to the grave, and what might still be hiding in the shadows. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar set fire to his own ships during a siege. A desperate move that may have doomed the greatest library the world had ever known. But was the Library of Alexandria really destroyed in a single blaze? Or did its downfall come from something far more insidious? Tonight, we piece together the fragments of this ancient tragedy and ask, what secrets died with it? Imagine a world where every book ever written sits in someone's basement, crumbling away. That was the Mediterranean before Alexandria. Scrolls from Athens, Babylon, and Memphis were scattered across a dozen languages, written on papyrus that rotted in humidity and clay tablets that shattered when dropped. Herophilus's work on human anatomy? Locked away in a private collection in coy Babylonian star charts? Gathering dust in a temple storeroom. Most texts existed in a single copy, and if a mouse chewed through it, that knowledge was gone forever. The Ptolemies had a problem. They ruled Egypt, but their real obsession was hoarding knowledge. Their solution was ruthless. Every ship that docked in Alexandria had its scrolls confiscated. The originals went to the library. The owners got cheap copies. They sent agents to Athens, Rhodes, even India, buying or stealing anything written. One account claims they borrowed Athens' official copies of Greek plays and forgot to return them, keeping the originals and sending back replicas. But collecting wasn't enough. They built the Museion, a research center where scholars lived rent-free with one job: organize the chaos. Think of it as the first version of Wikipedia, but with more togas. Teams worked around the clock copying deteriorating texts. They didn't just preserve, they standardized. Euclid's Elements got its definitive edition here. Lost works like Berosus's History of Babylon survived only because Alexandria made backups. The system had teeth. Scholars cross-checked translations against multiple sources, flagging errors. A medical text from India would get compared with Greek and Egyptian versions, with scribes noting contradictions in the margins. This wasn't storage, it was quality control. When Herophilus proved the brain, not the heart, controlled thought, his findings entered the library's master copies, overwriting Aristotle's mistakes. But there was a catch. All this relied on the Ptolemies' endless money and power. The library had no backup locations, no decentralized copies. Every scroll lived in one complex maintained by a single dynasty. When Rome eventually took over, they cared more about Egyptian grain shipments than preserving Babylonian poetry. The system worked brilliantly, until the people funding it lost interest. For now, though, Alexandria thrived. Scholars could stand in one room and trace an idea from a Sumerian clay tablet to a Greek commentary to an Egyptian practical application. It was the closest thing the ancient world had to a search engine. Callimachus stared at a nightmare. 500,000 scrolls filled the shelves of the great library, with no system to find anything. Need Plato's dialogue on Atlantis? Good luck. It might be wedged between a Babylonian grain ledger and an Egyptian love spell. His solution, the Penakes, wasn't just a catalog. It was the ancient world's first search algorithm. He divided knowledge into 8 categories: epic poetry, history, medicine, and others, with subcategories down to individual lines of verse. Each entry included the author's hometown, father's name, teachers they studied under, and even a credibility rating. Imagine Wikipedia profiles written by obsessive librarians with too much time. The entry for Hippocrates noted his birthplace, Kos, his teacher, Herodicus, and flagged which medical texts might be fake. The process was brutal. Teams worked in shifts, memorizing scroll contents on wax tablets before rushing back to update the master lists. No Control-F shortcuts. just scholars sweating over wooden frames strung with numbered tags. But it worked. A researcher could track an idea from a Sumerian proverb to its Greek adaptation, then find commentaries debating it. The catalog listed alternate titles, common misattributions, and even marked controversial passages with symbols. Cross-referencing was the killer feature. Aristotle's notes on Babylonian astronomy sat cataloged beside the original cuneiform tablets they referenced. Medical texts showed marginal notes comparing Greek theories with Egyptian practical remedies. This wasn't just storage, it was a conversation across languages and centuries, all searchable without a single piece of paper. The system was too advanced for its own good. Later libraries never matched the Pinakes' complexity. When Christian monks started copying ancient texts centuries later, they worked from scattered manuscripts with no indexes. Imagine losing Google and trying to reconstruct the internet from printed phone books. Yet for a few generations, it worked. A scholar in Alexandria could ask for all texts referencing triremes and get Phoenician shipbuilding manuals, Athenian naval tactics, and Egyptian reed boat designs, each with source ratings. It's no coincidence that the library's peak discoveries happened after the Pinakes. Meanwhile, in the shadow of those catalog racks, another librarian was solving a bigger puzzle. He glanced at two sticks in the ground and realized something impossible. The earth wasn't flat, and he could prove it with geometry. Eratosthenes noticed something odd about the shadows in Alexandria. At noon, on the summer solstice, while the sun burned directly overhead in Syene, so vertical it lit up the bottom of a well, a stick in Alexandria still cast a 7-degree shadow. That difference shouldn't exist if the earth was flat. He realized the curvature explained it. But he didn't stop there. The distance between the two cities was roughly 5,000 stadia, about 500 miles, a figure likely pulled from Egyptian land surveys in the library's archives. Using basic geometry, he calculated that 7 degrees was 1/50th of a full circle. Multiply 5,000 by 50, and you get 250,000 stadia, roughly 25,000 miles. Modern measurements put Earth's circumference at 24,901 miles. He was off by less than 1%. This wasn't a lucky guess. The library gave him Babylonian records of solar angles, Greek texts on geometry, and those precise Egyptian survey maps. Without those, he'd just be a guy staring at sticks. His method was replicable too. Later astronomers checked his work using different reference cities and got similar results. The kicker. He published all of this in a scroll called On the Measurement of the Earth, which the library promptly cataloged and cross-referenced with older cosmological texts. For the first time, someone didn't just claim the Earth was round, he proved it with numbers anyone could verify. But here's the tragedy. Later scholars like Posidonius redid the math with sloppier measurements and got a smaller circumference. By Ptolemy's time, Eratosthenes' original work was already fading. Columbus used the smaller, wrong number centuries later, which made Asia seem closer than it was. If he'd had Eratosthenes' actual calculations, he might have hesitated before sailing. The lesson wasn't just about the Earth's size. It showed what Alexandria did best. A librarian with access to Babylonian, Greek, and Egyptian records could synthesize knowledge in ways no single culture could alone. But it also showed how easily that knowledge could distort as it passed through copies and translations. Meanwhile, down in the library's workshops, another thinker was busy turning theoretical knowledge into something tactile. He wasn't measuring the Earth. He was building machines that hissed, pumped, and played music on their own. And unlike Eratosthenes' orderly calculations, his inventions bordered on magic. Ctesibius wasn't just a scholar. He was the library's resident mad engineer. While others debated philosophy, he built machines that hissed, sang, and kept time without human help. His workshop likely stank of hot metal and wet clay, crammed with prototypes that would have looked like magic to outsiders. Take his pipe organ, the hydraulis. It didn't just play notes. It used water pressure to force air through bronze pipes, creating sounds louder than any human lungs could produce. This wasn't just entertainment. It was the first known use of pneumatics in history, a principle that would later power steam engines and industrial machinery. His real obsession was precision. Egyptian water clocks had existed for centuries, but they dripped irregularly. Ctesibius redesigned them with feedback systems, a floating regulator that adjusted flow rates to keep perfect time. Some models even had gears that triggered automated displays, singing birds, moving statues, cascading water theaters. One account describes a parade float commissioned by Ptolemy VI, where a mechanical figure stood up and poured wine at set intervals. The crowd saw a miracle. Ctesibius saw physics. The library fed his work. Greek texts gave him the theory of pneumatics. Egyptian papyri contained blueprints for temple water systems. He likely had access to Babylonian gear designs and Phoenician metalworking manuals. In another era, he might have industrialized the Mediterranean. A surviving description of his force pump, a bronze cylinder with pistons and valves, shows it could have been scaled up to drain mines or fight fires. But without mass production or a market for machines, most remained one-offs. The tragedy isn't just that his devices were lost, it's that his textbooks vanished. Vitruvius mentions Ctesibius wrote 9 volumes on pneumatics, complete with equations and assembly instructions. Those scrolls would have been the era's equivalent of an engineering degree. Instead, medieval inventors had to reinvent water pumps centuries later from scratch. For a brief period, Alexandria connected theoretical genius with hands-on tinkering. Ctesibius proved that combining Greek math with Egyptian craftsmanship could birth entirely new technologies. But when the library's funding dried up, so did this culture of innovation. The hydraulis survived as a church instrument, stripped of its revolutionary mechanics. The force pumps rusted away, and the idea of an ancient industrial revolution died before it could really begin. Then came the fire, or at least that's what everyone remembers. The truth about the library's first major loss isn't as dramatic as flames. It's about a slow rot, both in parchment and in political will. Because when Caesar's troops accidentally torched the docks in 48 BC, the real damage wasn't the burning, it was what happened next. The flames that swept through Alexandria's docks in 48 BC weren't meant for the library. Caesar's troops had set fire to their own ships to block the enemy fleet, a tactical move that accidentally torched nearby warehouses. Some accounts claim the fire spread to parts of the Great Library, destroying up to 40,000 scrolls. Others insist the damage was minimal, like a modern archive losing a few filing cabinets. What's certain is that scholars kept working there for centuries after the fire. The real crisis wasn't the blaze, it was the slow bleed of neglect that followed. Rome took over Egypt, and the new governors had different priorities. The Ptolemies had treated the library like a crown jewel, but to the Romans it was just another provincial expense. Funding dried up. Maintenance stopped. Scrolls stored in damp underground chambers grew mold. The papyrus plant only lasts about 200 years in ideal conditions. Without constant recopying, texts disintegrated by default. Imagine a hard drive left in a flooded basement, except nobody bothered to make backups. The Serapeum, a smaller sister library across town, fared better for a while. It wasn't as grand, but it kept the lights on. Scholars could still access copies of major works there well into the 4th century. One visitor in 350 AD described seeing Aristotle's entire catalog on display, proof that much survived the so-called destruction centuries earlier. But the Serapeum had its own problem, location. It sat atop a hill in Alexandria's pagan quarter, a prime target when Christianity became Rome's official religion. Meanwhile, the original library's ruins became a cautionary tale. Roman politicians occasionally paid lip service to restoring it, like promising to fix potholes during election season. One emperor, Claudius, even built an addition in 41 AD, not for scrolls, but for his own awful histories. The message was clear. Knowledge only mattered when it served power. By the time Hypatia walked those halls in 400 AD, whole wings had been repurposed as storage for grain taxes. The fire myth persists because it's dramatic, a single moment of tragedy. But decay doesn't make for good storytelling. No heroic last stands, just bureaucrats quietly slashing budgets year after year. When the Serapeum finally fell in 391 AD, it wasn't to flames but to a mob with crowbars. They tore apart the last intact collection not because they feared the texts, but because they'd stopped valuing them. One witness wrote that the streets ran with ink that day, not from burning scrolls but from emptied ink pots, intentionally spilled to ensure nothing could be written again. The last librarian had already fled, taking what she could carry. And somewhere in the ruins, a single line from Euripides still clung to a broken piece of papyrus. The tongue swore, but the mind was unsworn. It was a fitting epitaph. Hypatia walked through Alexandria's crumbling lecture halls in 415 CE, teaching geometry to students who barely understood what they were losing. She wasn't just a mathematician. She was the last living link to the library's golden age. Her lectures on conic sections and planetary motion sounded like heresy to the new powers in the city. When the Christian bishop Cyril decided pagan knowledge had to go, Hypatia became the perfect target. A mob dragged her from her chariot, stripped her naked, and scraped her flesh off with broken pottery. They burned her body in the ruins of the Serapeum, the library's last surviving wing. The Library of Alexandria didn't just burn, it withered. The real killer wasn't flames, but indifference. When political support dried up, so did the funding for repairs, scribes, and new scrolls. Even the best ideas rot without someone willing to pay for their survival. Today, we've got servers instead of scrolls, but the same rule applies. Knowledge only lasts if someone cares enough to preserve it. How much farther ahead would we be if those 500,000 texts had survived? Maybe we'd know. For now, take advice from history. Back up your work. The past has a way of disappearing.